Okay, 5:40. We'll start the meeting. Could people close the door? Well, meeting is still open, but so welcome to SUNSET4. As usual, we're bound to the note well. Everything you say are bound to this. We're going to pass on the blue sheets, if you don't mind. We have a volunteer for scribing. Thanks, Fred. And mailing this and Jabber. It would be good to have people scribing on the Jabber and relay whoever is on remote. We also have Meet Echo remote, so we'll try to manage this. Only one item today should be short and easy. IPv4 declared historic, so maybe we'll be ready for dinner sooner, right? So, Oli, any change or suggestion for the agenda, Bashan? One.
Okay. Anyone want to suggest we not do this? My name is Lee Howard. Not wearing a badge or any dots right now. I'm practicing non-attachment today. This is going to be an interesting conversation. I want to have both a discussion and a meta discussion about declaring IPv4 historic. So I just have 10 slides. So I'd really like to get through all the slides to make sure we're having the same conversation about the same document together. And then, of course, the floor will be open. We've got a pretty good amount of time for discussing one document. Go ahead. So let's start with the definition of historic. Now, RFC 2026 defines historic for us. It says that a specification that has been superseded by a more recent specification is historic, or is for any other reason considered to be obsolete. It goes on to say that standards track specifications must not depend on any standards track spec of a lower status, meaning that anything that has a normative reference, any standard that depends on something that's a lower, it can't depend on something that's a lower status than that. Go ahead. So this would obsolete RFC 791. And then, what did you say, Fred? Would you like to take that? Actually, you know what? If you let me get through the slides, I think I will address that.
Yes.
And then we can have the conversation. Thank you. So that does beg the question, is IPv4 historic? Well, so IPv4 has been superseded by a more recent specification, IPv6. It even says in RFC 2460, IPv version 6 is a new version of the Internet Protocol, designed as the successor to IP version 4. So that's my argument for why this is the successor protocol that supersedes it. Therefore, RFC 791 is historic. I further would say, and do say, that IPv4 has inherent limitations that we just couldn't figure out any other way around. Can't be mitigated. That's why we developed a new protocol that doesn't have these limitations. And current and future work builds on IPv6. Therefore, it's better for every purpose than the old protocol. Next slide. I further, in the document, go on to say that the use of IPv4 is deprecated. Now, this is something that when we get there, I will encourage further discussion on, because I've already heard significant comments saying that this is probably belongs in a different draft, that declaring v4 historic is enough for one document. Deprecating its use is different. So declaring something historic is something the IETF does to itself. That's something that's internal to the IETF structure. Deprecating something in this sense, and there isn't a formal definition for deprecated in the IETF context, or at least for specifications for the RFC series. So this is a new definition used, and so I've defined it to say deprecated means a feature, characteristic, or practice that should be avoided. And I took that definition from a variety of sources, mostly Wikipedia. Now that, even in the definition that I've used, that doesn't mean that the practice is harmful necessarily. That could be one reason to deprecate, but that does not, we don't say that it's harmful. It just says that in this case, there will be no further developments in IPv4, and therefore Those using the old version are encouraged and advised to transition to the newer version. Next slide. So I've got 2 slides about the implications. The first set of implications, and this is sort of what Fred was trying to jump in with, is that by moving an internet standard to historic maturity level, it doesn't mean it can't be used. So that's actually a non-implication. We can still use IPv4 even if it's historic. It does mean that we can't, that any standards track document with a normative reference to RFC is also historic, and we can't do any updates there. And that would include any RFC defining IPv4 options. Do you need to start to interject now, or do you just want to be first in line?
I want you to go back 1 slide and let's talk about deprecated, because the term that Fred Baker, random Cisco, so
point of clarification, we did ask that we hold the questions till the end, because otherwise we'll debate what you think the slides are about rather than what they're actually about.
So, I'm sure that we will be jumping back and forth between all these slides. So, anything that uses RFC 791 as a normative reference that's dependent on it would become historic, but there are other RFCs that refer to 791 that aren't necessarily, wouldn't necessarily become historic, like DNS. The DNS RFC does define the A record and inatter.arpa, but it's not dependent on those. DNS still exists without IPv4. Obviously, we use it in IPv6. It's just, it would then be updated because the A records, the A record, for instance, does depend on it. So, but yeah, so go ahead. Next slide. So further implications, and this is kind of implications of implications. The IETF can't update something once we declare it historic. That's sort of part of the definition for the reason we define something as being historic. So therefore, as I say in the document, the IETF will no longer work on IPv4 technologies, including transition technologies. That's also a term that's come up on the list as being debatable, and whether we include transition technologies or not is absolutely up for discussion. And taken almost directly from RFC 6540, the term IP, without specifying an address family, will just be assumed to mean IPv6. So you wouldn't need to update a document that just says Internet Protocol or IP, because we can just infer that it means IPv6. Go on, almost there. So we've got a security considerations section. So it is possible that bugs inherent to IPv4 will still be discovered. And according to the definition of historic, if we declare IPv4 historic, we can't revise IPv4 in order to fix those bugs. Now, I will say, I don't think we're likely to find any bugs that are particular to the Internet Protocol version 4 with its, its packet specification. That seems unlikely that we wouldn't have found them yet. However, it's possible, and so we need to be aware that if we say that if we declare it historic, that we will not be making any updates to it, and therefore the security consideration is, for security reasons, the use of IPv6 exclusively is recommended, just in case we do find a security bug in IPv4. Almost last. There's an IANA consideration segment, section also, and basically what I say in the IANA consideration section is IANA can keep doing what it's doing. IANA right now, in case you don't know, has some recovered IPv4 address space. They're handing it out every 6 months in evenly distributed among the 5 RIRs. I believe their next chunk will be a /18 in September to each RIR, and there will be no block larger than a /22. So that doesn't sound, and then the chunk in next, a year from now, next March, will be even smaller, probably something like a /20 to each RIR. This is not address space that's going to last very long, so I actually don't think that this is this is not an important consideration for this document. I'd like to also add, subject to discussion, that IANA should not yet, we do not yet direct IANA to update the IPv version numbers registry. Don't remove 4 from the list of IP versions. The IPv4 address space registry, all of the address space that IANA allocated directly many years ago and has allocated to the RIRs, that registry should still be maintained. And inatter.arpa delegations, I do not suggest that those be removed. I think that's probably premature at this point. Willing to discuss. Next slide. One is because several people have come to me with suggestions for things that we need to do in order to get IPv4 out of the way. And so I wanted to make a list here of the things that IETF can do and can't do. So there are a couple here that have check marks that are things we've already done. We've already recommended a transition schedule, although when I say we, that may have been an independent series document. I don't remember off the top of my head. We've published many deployment guides saying, here's how you transition to IPv6 in a variety of scenarios and technologies. We can stop working on IPv4 and transition technologies. That's what this document would do. We can separate that into separate documents if we want to exclude transition technologies. We can recommend against IPv4. That would be deprecating IPv4. That's what the current version says. We, IETF, could also tell the IAOC to do some things, like require IPv6 or only do IPv6. Those are things we could do that aren't in this document. Seems like those are completely separate conversations to have. We could, and this may be we, IAB, more than IETF, could send notes to SDO liaisons saying, you should deprecate IPv4, or at least make sure that all of your work that involves IP uses IPv6. We could say that IPv4 is at functional parity with IPv6. We could say that. It might be debated, but we could say it. We could, something I said in the last slide, tell IANA to remove the IPv4 assignment table records. We could tell IANA to remove the inatter.arpa. I don't think we should yet, but those are things that IETF can do. So things that we can't do, the IETF can't stop routing IPv4. That is not in our power. Routers are run by people who run routers, and that's not us. We can't tell ICANN to require IPv6 and TLDs. I don't think that we have that authority. I think that ICANN might have that authority, I don't know, but I don't think that we have the authority to tell them that. We can't, I don't think, impose a flag day for operators to switch. That's not something, because operators, I don't think, will feel bound to honor that flag day. We can't force retail products to support IPv6, and we can't force CPE vendors to implement IPv6 well. I wish we could. We also can't prevent people from using IPv4. There's, we can't prevent it, and if you want to use IPv4 on your network, it's your network. You can use any protocol you want to on your network, it's your network. The only thing that we have to make sure is that we are ensuring interoperability. Next slide. So, this is my last slide. So, frequently at this point in a conversation, in a presentation, the presenter or the chairs will ask for a show of hands, who's read the document? I'm not going to do that because now everybody in the room has read the document because I've just presented the full text. And the reason I did this, I wanted to make sure that everybody actually knew what this document does and does not do. I think that's, otherwise we're going to have an argument against straw mans. So my biggest questions are, does IPv4 meet the definition of historic? If it doesn't, I'd really like to hear when it would. What are the criteria under which we would declare it historic? I'm interested to know, and we probably do need to figure out what RFCs would be made obsolete or historic by doing this, and if there are any other implications. And of course, always in this working group, it's what other gaps does SUNSET4 need to work on? I do include, finally, in the italics, a specification that has been superseded by a more recent specification. That's the nut of what the definition of historic says. Fred, now you can go to the microphone. Thank you. Back to you. Would you like to moderate?
Fred Baker, Cisco Systems. RFC 1158, section 3.1 defines deprecated.
Sorry, what is 1158?
Yeah.
What is that RFC?
So it's talking about deprecated objects in SNMP.
Okay. So
okay.
So yes, that's what I thought is that we have used deprecate in reference to code points and specific MIB objects. We have not defined deprecate in the sense of an RFC. Do you think that definition applies? Would you like to read it to us?
It's interesting. We can argue about whether it applies, but it's interesting.
Yes.
Okay. With respect to a MIB object, it says that it must be supported, but it will probably be deleted in the next version of the specification.
Interesting. Deprecated means
so
deprecate means you must support, but it's going to be deleted soon.
Yeah, don't rely on it. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just kind of interesting there.
Yes.
Okay. Other comment. There's an awful lot of RFCs that use the term IP and are referring to IPv4. And if you take that and read back into it, IPv6, you probably wouldn't want what you came out with. Your update list would be really long.
I think we need examples in Sunset 4 because I think that's the charter, that exactly is the charter for this working group, is to go fix those.
Okay.
Is it not?
Your update list is really long.
Like, conceded, yes.
Dave Taylor. I agree with Fred's point that the terminology of IP meaning, IPv6 is something that is separate from all the rest of your discussion,
Okay.
or should be separate from the rest of your discussion. Does it meet the definition of historic? Yes, but I wanted to disagree with one of the implications, though I think all the rest of them are right, and your summary slide at the end was right, I think. But if you wouldn't mind going back to the slide that had the quote from, I think it was the first one that had the quote. I think it was the first one after the title slide, which I'll use as the context. Yeah, that one. Okay. The key word that I want to give as the intro is the fifth word in the bottom paragraph. The fifth word in the bottom paragraph is the word normally.
Normally.
Okay. So that's the context. It says, yes, you can in fact have a downward reference, but it has to be approved by the IESG, and there's RFCs that specify the procedures for that. 3967 is one of them, and that one is updated by 4897 in case somebody's keeping notes. So now if you can go forward to the one that had the implications, the specific implication I wanted to comment on was the one that you said you can't do transition technologies. 3967 specifically uses one of the cases of when a downward reference is okay as long as it's approved by the ISG is when doing a transition technology. So just declaring it as historic does not automatically mean that, sorry, we can't do any transition technologies that reference IPv4 anymore. That is actually one of the explicit cases that says the IESG will consider it, right? They still have to approve it, right? But it doesn't mean that the IETF can't do it. I think all the rest of your implications are right, but that one was not.
So can I ask you two questions to follow up on what you just said? So the first one was, no, I forgot what the first one was. The second was, so you said, yes, we could, we don't have to, by declaring before historic, we don't automatically have to stop work on transition technologies. But this document could say that,
right,
or could not say that. We can say it either way. Do you have an opinion?
This is why I think it does meet the requirements of historic, and it doesn't block us from doing things that people want to do. By things, I mean saying, here's what's bad about IPv4, here's how to transition, here's how, you can still take normative reference to there subject to the approval of the IFG, even if it's marked as historic, right? And so that's why I'm saying yes to yes, I think it should be declared historic, because in my mind, it does not have the problems that people would bring up that I think would be blocking. That there are ways around that, and those are just subject to IESG approval.
Thank you.
Philip Allen Baker, not speaking for Komodo Group Inc. Couple of points. First of all, do not do anything that invites ridicule. If this passed, it would invite ridicule outside the IETF. You cannot get rid of IPv4 simply by declaring that you don't like it. And that is how that will be seen. But whether or not you think that IPv6 deployment has succeeded, for most people who are using the net today, it isn't there. Net 10 has an it has an infinite address space. Net 10 has not been exhausted. 10.x.x.x will never be exhausted because anybody can have their own.
No.
Yeah. Look, have another. Have another. Yes, you might think that you can say IPv4 can be shut down, but the most people who use the internet will say no. Point number two, do not do anything that declares IPv4 right for the taking for somebody else to set up their own SDO to manage IPv4. I would be very happy to take, generous donations of 10K apiece from companies who want to continue IPv4 activities. And point three, if somebody comes to me and says, I've got this great protocol, but it only works on IPv6. My response to them is, well, I have absolutely zero interest in your protocol. I am not going to implement your protocol. If you cannot work on the internet as it is today, then you're not serious, and I don't want to have to bother with you. So if you are going to say that the IETF from now on can only deal with non-serious applications, I think that is a very, very bad decision.
I want to, your first comment, because I think the rest sort of hang from there, is not just, well, do nothing that invites ridicule, then I would never get anything done. So I think what you said is that this would be perceived as trying to turn off IPv4. That's not what the document says, but you think it'll be perceived that way elsewhere in the world. Is that fair?
There's a big difference between you doing something that invites ridicule for you,
Yeah.
and something that invites ridicule of the IETF.
I was being snarky, but to make sure that I'm understanding, because I don't think the document says, I think I pretty clearly said, we're not saying turn off v4, but you think it'll be seen that way anyway.
I think that there is no way that you can spin this.
Thank you.
Rüdiger Volk. I am slightly surprised to agree with objections by Phil. But actually, he took away some of my points. There is something, there are words that are common to our languages. There is the concept of throwing out the baby, the bath, whatever, the baby and the bath water.
Yes.
Before repeating Phil's points, just let me say, well, okay, you have raised the questions whether necessary conditions that allow to do it are true. Of course, we also should ask the question whether we have sufficient reasons.
And that was part of my last slide. Questions is, if not now, under what conditions?
For the sufficient reasons, I'm essentially seeing things like points like Phil raised as being counter arguments. We really should be very careful that the public does not get the perception that the IETF lost connection to the reality. That would be really bad.
So when, there's a point where the perception of what this would do would match other people's perceptions, right? I mean, so there's a point where that changes. Can you describe when that would be?
No, oops.
Well said.
I don't have ready criteria for it. What I'm seeing is, and I agree totally to the intention of very clearly giving signals that we are moving, and that departments that say, well, okay, are you assuming when you ask someone who's presenting a new product, whether and the slides show IPv4 addresses for the management access? And when I see such a thing, I'm asking, well, okay, is that indicating that you are not fully supporting the v6? And well, okay, maybe the guy from the next department asks me, well, are you serious about v6 for this application? I do not. I fully agree. We should put strong signs out. I'm not quite sure how to do that well. Declaring deprecation or historic at the moment, in my opinion, would be perceived as something where
well, okay, the IETF is talking in ways that are disconnected from reality, and that would be really bad. And the potential of some other party saying, well, okay, their time has gone, our time has come, I think is really bad, and would in fact counter our intention of moving on to V6. So be careful there. I don't know how to send the clear signal that we want to see out there.
Thank you.
I'm putting myself virtually in the mic line behind Jeff.
Kyle Rose. So when I read the draft originally, the impression I got was that you were basically saying, well, according to the definitions, IPv4 is historic, and therefore we don't need to take any action. And I think one of the interesting things about this is that it seems like implicit from the definition that there is action that was triggered without intent. Like we didn't intend for IPv4 to become historic, it just is by definition. And does that call into question the definition itself?
So yeah, there's a good, I think, almost ontological question about, gee, what's changed, and was IPv4 historic yesterday if the draft didn't exist? And a lot of this, there's always the IETF housekeeping of, oh, we just realized actually one of the dependencies for this draft would be V6 needs to be full standard. We need RFC 2460 BIS to be published, because you can't have it depend on we can't have everything else depending on a lower status draft. So to me, that was yes, that's a fair, reasonable question to which I don't have a good answer, except that you wouldn't automatically, whenever publishing a new version, automatically say, therefore the previous version is historic. I think generally we wait some time to make sure that the new version is in fact production ready, that it is ready to be promoted to full standard, and so on. We need the live experience before we can say, okay, we're done with the previous version.
Right. So I would just interpret the definitions to have an implied intent involved in applying the definition to an existing standard. And so I don't believe that IPv4 is historic because we haven't said it is yet. That's what this is supposed to do.
Right.
And so I would actually reword the draft to not state that IPv4 is historic. Reword it to say that
we declare
it to be.
IPv4 is declared to be historic.
Right. I mean, and I'm not saying that we should support that or not, right? I'm just saying that I don't like the way it's written at the moment.
You may certainly say whether you support that or not.
I'll pass.
Jeff Houston, you're way too premature. And I think part of it is the pragmatic view of a standards body is not to believe its own bullshit. The pragmatic view of a standards body is to create specifications that not only allow interoperation, two different folk make the same widget, the widgets interconnect and work properly, but a third party that relies on a generic widget understands what it can rely on.
Mm-hmm.
That's the job of standards. It's not the job to have opinions, it's to facilitate different players to produce into a market. Fine. In our own history, we can see our own failure of standards. The most abysmal failure that comes to my mind is the crap that was surrounded the attitude of NATs. We will not standardize NATs, said the IETF, or various folk in it. So instead, NATs got produced relying on the creativity of obsessive compulsives whom you should never allow to be creative, because those guys are really nuts at being creative. Not only did different vendors produce different NATs that behave differently, but different models from the same vendor produce different behaviors, and even the same model number produced different behaviors because you got what you wanted. The complete lack of a specification, so folk just did it. So if you walk away, you're not solving a problem, you're making it infinitely worse. When can we turn off V4? When everyone's running V6.
Everyone?
Everyone, because
every host in the world.
Because the real issue is At some point, if I want to run 6 only, I've got to see the rest of the world, and I can't turn it off until I'm into that state. Fine. I don't know when that's going to happen. What I do know is that we've crammed around 10 billion devices into the V4 network, and it's going to get bigger before it gets any smaller. To get this to happen, we're fundamentally changing the semantics and behavior of V4. A V4 address is not a permanent endpoint identification token anymore. We're over that. We're now looking at addresses as temporal conversations that support conversations. And if I understand quick correctly, I'm even over that. All I want out of a V4 address is to remain permanent for one RTT. We're pushing the boundaries because we have to. Now, if we walk away from this, either Philip Hallam Baker's right and someone else walks in, that's a good world. A bad world is we get creative again individually. And my creative solution will be different to yours. Now, it will be a competition about who's obsessively compulsive the worst way. But if we walk away from this, we're going to kill this. Because we are probably going to have to cram 15 billion or even 20 billion devices into this dual stack world before we can walk out of it. And necessarily, I suspect, as we change the semantics of an IPv4 address, we might need to think about specifications that others can rely on and we can interoperate with that will help us do the impossible and cram that many in. But oh no, it's historic, we can't change it, is either hubris or insanity. I'm not sure which, but I'll take a book on it, we'll have bets. Thank you.
So thank you for your last few sentences. Did help me crystallize a case where we might want to change the semantics because of the different kinds of address sharing or transitivity that we're talking about. So that was because I was wondering, what would we be changing in IPv4? So you did give me an example, and thank you, because now I think I have a stronger idea of what you're talking for. Of course, I have long disagreed with you about the inevitability of NATs, and I think there are others who would also say, gee, maybe end-to-end addressing is better than that. But that's a fair argument for us to have.
You know, these days I have web assets on Cloudflare. I'm sitting behind the NAT. And interestingly, there's no permanence every time I go to my website. It changes addresses, and I seem to change address, and it doesn't seem to matter. What have we done to addresses? And my point is, at some point, I rely on standards for vendors and everyone else to do this in a way that Cisco can make product, Juniper can make product, Google can do product, and it works. If we walk out of this at this point and go, nope, nothing's changing, when it is indeed changing, we would not have done anyone a service as a standards body should do. So attitude, what I want, what we need are different things sometimes.
So with apologies, the people are still standing in line. There's one other thing that I wanted to respond to on that, which was, I don't think we have to wait until every device, every host with an IP stack speaks IPv6 before IPv4 can be turned off, is what you said, which is not quite related to this document, right? This is historic, and that is sunset.
If we're arguing about whether it's 2050 or 2048, I don't care either. It's just not today.
Well, no, because the only thing I care about is the devices that I talk to. I don't care about things that I don't talk to. And if it's through translation, which is sort of, does feed to your point about NATs, then, hey, I can turn off V4 on my host because I can get to a V6 translator in front of yours.
Only if it works by standards.
So, just a couple quick points. This is Wes George, and I'm speaking not as a chair. I'm speaking as an individual. I think one of the things that we haven't really noted here is that the majority of the IETF protocols are not concerned with whether it's IPv4 or IPv6. If it's properly written, the protocol will work over both. There are only a certain subset of IETF protocols that actually care. And some of them shouldn't but do. Some of them do because they have to. And so this really isn't a question of if IETF stops working on IPv4, anything that uses IPv4 is suddenly going to stop working or won't be able to continue. but more looking at the subset of documents and standards that need to know something about which IP version they're using in order to do what they do, and the question of how long we need to maintain 100% backward compatibility. In terms of, even if we believe that most everything is going to work, but we're not necessarily going to optimize for that design anymore. You know, when people deprecate something in the software world, they might stop supporting an old version of code, say Windows XP, and the new version that they release that has a bunch of optimizations that work well better on Windows 10 might still work on Windows XP, but if I've stopped supporting Windows XP and you raise a bug on it, I'm going to ignore you. So yeah, we may not be there yet. I mean, it's certainly a valid point to say no, that there needs to be a much more broad deployment of IPv6 before we get to that point. But I'd like to caution against hand-wringing on IETF is going to stop working on IPv4 when the vast majority of the things that IETF does aren't actually affected by that statement. The other concern that was expressed was that, you know, the IETF looks like it's lost its connection to reality. I'm going to refrain from being snarky here, but observe that the IETF's timescale is quite a bit longer than the rest of reality, because we're the ones that have to define the standards that get implemented for the rest of the world to use. Thus, we're going to be premature in the eyes of the world when we make forward-looking statements like this. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, and it may still be premature, but it is still going to be out ahead of when the world catches up and says, yes, this is the right idea. So I'm not certain that this is necessarily us inviting ridicule as much as it is us doing our job and looking at things out into the future several years, because that's the time scale we operate on.
Barbara Stark, AT&T. I guess what I'm struggling with is trying to understand, what do you really expect this to achieve? That is, you know, I mean, we know when, you know, you deprecate MIBs or HTML tags or things like that, you expect in a period of, you know, 3-5 years or something that people don't have to code to that anymore. And, you know, by the way, the web pages have to grow up and use CSS instead of font tags and things like that. With this, what are you hoping to achieve?
So the primary thing that changes by changing to historic is we can't update RFC 791, which we've only ever done 3 times anyway. So, I mean, big deal.
Right.
So but there's also then the dependency chain, which is work to be done, is to go figure out what that chain is, to say the following documents are historic and the following and other documents are updated. So I don't know, for instance.
That still doesn't tell me what tangible, outwardly visible, real impact.
We can stop wasting time on IPv4 specific technologies.
How much time are we wasting on it now?
We had excellent chairs who said, gee, maybe we're not going to talk about 6 drafts that were proposed for discussion at this working group on a new transition technology. I don't know if you guys would characterize that as being a relevant case here. Now, I think Jeff's example is actually a really good one. It's very interesting to say, would we want to make changes to the v4 addressing schema in the future in order to extend the life of v4 and make it work better through NATs or other address sharing ideas? Or would we say, yeah, that's not time we want to spend. We should say we've got a solution for that. It's called IPv6.
So your goal that I'm hearing is to put a stake in the ground that you can point to say, no, we're not going to do that work because it's on IPv4 and would be a waste of our time?
Yes.
Okay. That wasn't clear. You may want, you know, to the point of preventing people from eye-rolling and things like that, you may want to make it clear that that is in fact the goal.
I will look at the notes after the meeting, and I will try to revise and put in some friendlier language to make that clearer. Thank you.
Hi, Aaron Falk. 2 comments. One, well, I guess first I came in very sympathetic to this proposal, and I find myself strongly persuaded by Philip and Rudiger that maybe not to the extreme that they're going to, but I think that the perception issue and the other SDO issue is a real one. Another concern that's worth thinking about here is that when you change a standard to historic, you can't have a normative reference to it, which means if we build a new technology that we want to have be a standard, and there is some specific IPv4 dimension of it, can't have a normative reference. Well, you know, you can have a normative
Normally, yeah. Apparently,
can.
I was
Okay,
mistaken.
fine.
David,
Thank you.
yeah, David
Thank
corrected
you.
us.
I stand corrected.
This is extraordinary, not normal.
Yeah. So, so I think that we can't get out of the business of supporting v4 because we have an enormous user base, and we need to support that user base. And so, while we may not want to take on v4 specific efforts in the IETF, we can't say we are no longer going to do any v4 efforts. And so I'm not sure what the sort of the near to medium term practical impact is going to be within the IETF in terms of managing work. But I sympathize that we don't want to, but we got to support our users. And so in that regard, the other point I wanted to make is that we're kind of like a company that is doing a major upgrade on a product. Right? We've got this fancy new thing. It's much better than the old thing. We hate supporting the old thing because it sucks and we've had to live with all the warts for a long time and we want to get rid of it. However, we have customers who've invested a lot of time and energy getting used to it and they don't want to get off it. And so you have to sort of encourage them to do that, right? And so companies, they declare an end of life where they say, okay, well, you've got a couple of years and you got to start thinking about this transition and then we're going to stop supporting it. Now, I think we've had some discussion on what a reasonable end of life for IETF support for IPv4 might be. And just based on the amount of it that's currently out there running, I don't think that, you know, we can stop developing technologies that we know work well with V4 until we're pretty confident that most of the internet isn't using V4, whether we like it or not. We built it, we own it. But I do think that it's important that if we do make any of these decisions, that they should be far enough out in the future. We don't want people surprised, and we want to encourage people to have a graceful transition that doesn't, have a strong negative effect on their business, and give them an incentive to find somebody other than the IETF to do their V4 work for them.
So, thank you, and I wanted to respond, to say that was exactly a point that I kind of wanted to make earlier, that this may well be several years premature, and that's okay, because I think it's a good time to start having the conversation so that when we have it, whenever the right time is, it's not a complete surprise to everybody. So that's part of why I wanted to talk about also, and that's the meta conversation that's on the last slide, is so when would we, how do I know when to come back to Sunset 4 and say, hey, remember this draft that expired X years ago? I'm back. Or is it just, let's do some refining and talk about it every few meetings, and we'll sort of keep it going for a while. I'm willing to do that too. Yeah,
Wilhelm Baker. So concrete example of a specification in process right now, TCP increased security. If that doesn't work over v4, it's dead to me. But the other thing was, it strikes me that if you go back to that, the previous one that said, go back to this previous slide, we don't need to be bound by RFC 2026 enumeration of statuses. The ISG can create a new status at will. And so maybe what we need for IPv4 is, it's complicated. Or complicated, I suspect. I mean, drawing on my experience as an S&P 500 corporate spokesperson, I'd say complicated. And a draft coming out saying, an RFC saying, these are the ways that IPv4 was expected to behave, and here is how IPv4 now behaves in the real world. And it isn't historic, and it isn't deprecated, but it is saying, when you tread on this landmine, here's how it's going to injure you. And I think that that would be something that would be useful to the community as a whole. Now, to answer your question, when can you turn it off? Well, when can we get rid of MAC addresses? Think about it. Every packet that we're sending on the net, over the Ethernet, it's got a MAC address. Now, why do MAC addresses exist? Well, because people still want to run their Apple Talk and their Novell and all those protocols that haven't existed for years. Is there anybody? Yes, but why does Ethernet not just use TCP?
Take it to the
Yes, but why isn't it TCP? If we're in a world where IP is the only thing, why?
Why do we have layers?
Yeah, well, no. Why do we have that layer? Why do we multiplex between those protocols when the world only uses one? No.
I'm afraid I may not be smart enough to understand your point.
We have a layer in there because at one point we had multiple networking technologies, and we can't get rid of that layer because even though I don't know anybody who's using anything other than IPv4 or IPv6, but the infrastructure that exists has that assumption built in that there is such a thing as a MAC address. And whereas if you were to design the network hardware today from the assumption that only IP was there, your hub would not be an Ethernet hub. It would be an IP router. And you would design your hardware differently, and you wouldn't need that layer. But you can't go to that, even though people don't use it anymore. So the question about when you can eliminate IPv4 is probably after you're dead.
Barbara notes from the floor that there are a lot of ether types in use. Nalini?
Nalini Elkins. I want to kind of follow on to what Barbara said. I thought that maybe you wanted to start a slightly different discussion that I think is actually quite interesting. It's one thing to talk about what the IETF should do and where it should spend its time in terms of what drafts to work on and so forth. It's quite another to suggest or start the discussion in the wider community about what they should do and where they should go. What I was thinking that maybe you were saying, and tell me what you were actually thinking, is that you were wanting to encourage people to adopt IPv6 in the wider world. Am I somewhere?
Let me say that I absolutely do want people to adopt IPv6 in the broader world. I don't think this document says that. Now, I am aware of some of the optics that it probably sounds like it says that, and from going and looking at non-technical lists and non-IETF lists, that's definitely people's first reaction before declared historic. Oh, well, they're just trying to get forces to use IPv6, and that's why I went through the slides. I went through the entire text of the document, was to say I was trying to scope this document down to just the specific IETF context.
Right. No, I totally see. That's what you were saying to Barbara, and I totally get that. Of course, in the a particular age that we live in, or maybe we've always lived in, what people read and is the title, and then they, imagine all kinds of things.
If people read the title and don't read the document and deploy IPv6, I guess I'd probably be okay with that.
No, sure. But again, I think, as I said, other people want to speak, but the discussion, I frankly think maybe more needs to be had is why is it that it's taken so long to adopt IPv6?
RFC 6540.
So there is, as Wes points out, there is RFC 6540, which talks about some of that. There are studies by, in particular, the RIRs, the NRO, have done studies surveying people. When are you going to deploy IPv6? Why haven't you yet? What are your biggest hurdles? And then I go and point at the common statistics by Google and Eric Vinke showing the growth over time, which I find encouraging. So to say people aren't deploying IPv6 isn't quite accurate, I think. It's people haven't yet, but a lot of people are. And so, it's, how long shall they do?
No, sure. No, I'll get off. A lot of people are now, which is, of course, wonderful.
Right. Fair.
Eric Nygren. I think some of it may be, I think there's a little bit of this where we're getting stuck up on the wording of historic, where I think if we kind of abstract that out to some other term, it may be easier to make some of the conversation left. It's directionally historic or something. I'm not going to try to come up with terms now, but if we try to look at what are we trying to accomplish, I think one of the big things we want to accomplish is reducing the time window we're in where a large portion of the internet's running in a dual stack environment where people are expected to, you have to make your device have functional parity on both IPv4 and IPv6. Your protocols need to have functional parity on IPv4 and IPv6. And especially, I think there was an allusion on the mailing list to what signals are we sending to other standards bodies who are working on things, where being able to indicate that, hey, it's okay to build something that is IPv6 only, where it's only IPv4 access is through IPv4 as a service over IPv6, is a signal that would be good to send, because there seems to be a lack of visibility into how far along we actually are into the v6 deployment process. There's a lot of people who think v6 deployment is back where it was a few years ago. It might actually be interesting to see a show of hands from people where they think v6 deployment is. So there may be a way to reframe this that doesn't really go straight to historic, but instead is explicitly calling out what you're trying to do is telling people, hey, we're on the direction to be historic. And if you're developing a new protocol, it's acceptable to develop it in a way that is v6 only, but you might want to consider having v4 as a service transition technologies for now. Mm-hmm. And on your question of when would be a good time to do this, to actually switch it to historic, I think a good point might be when more people have deployed v6 only environments, and that it's more of a norm rather than an exception. Because I think right now when you have the T-Mobile US and the Facebook and a few others who are starting to really do, and a few of the broadband cable providers and some sections of Comcast that are in this, okay, we've deployed v6 only, it makes our life actually, in some world, it makes our lives dramatically simpler not to have to deal with dual stack, and maybe to have a v4 transition technology there present or not. And that hopefully that will become increasingly common because it reduces complexity. And once that starts becoming something that's not just a few trailblazers experimenting with it and having to iron out the bugs, but a normal way of deploying things, that seems like a good point to say, okay, here's this way that a bunch of people, it's not just some big companies with lots of smart people to work on it, have done it. You can do it too. You don't really need v4 anymore. That then at that point, the historic label becomes one that probably has less controversy around it because you can point to a lot more examples.
So just to be clear, you said when more people have deployed IPv6 only, you meant more than have now, not necessarily more than have deployed v4.
Correct.
Okay.
Like a point where it's like, I think there is a bit of this, I don't even think you need to get to 50% who've deployed v6 only. I think at some point when
But you did enough representation that we will know in heterogeneous environments that v6 only is a viable alternative. And in this case, I think what you say is when we say v6 only, we mean including translation potentially.
May or may not include the translation. I think there's some, and I think encouraging people in that hey, you probably, if you're hooking end users up to the internet, probably need the translation. But if you're deploying things in your own server environment cluster or your own private scenario, you may actually not need the translation because there are a number of places that are starting to run successfully without that translation now.
Okay, so proposed drafts that I've heard from you, it's v4 going to be declared historic, and from Philip, v4 considered complicated, right? Okay.
So there's also been a couple of points made in Jabber that, well, it's not specific, like reading people. I do see that there's two things that have come up a couple times now. One is a question about whether it's worth having a statement from the IESG sort of adding a barrier to, we're not really interested in approving new IPv4 only work unless it's really justified. That question has come up before, but that's one of the things that we should maybe think about. And the other thing is some support for the idea that it's probably still valid to have liaison statements happening that say something about IPv6 to our partner SDOs, saying you really need to take this seriously now, as kind of separate things that are offshoots from whatever we choose to do within the IETF.
I will see if I can find somebody in the IAB who would like to suggest that.
Okay, Rüdiger Volk again, and I'm sidetracking a little, but well, okay. Take an observation of how work in the IETF actually displays use of V4 and V6. I don't think I did see any slides today where examples that were supposed to be generic for the address family actually used V6.
Yes, absolutely. You know what?
Would we need the historic status to change that?
Working group chairs everywhere should insist that their presenters use V6 addresses in their examples instead of V4 addresses.
Hi, Peter, Facebook. So first of all, thank you for doing this work. Facebook has 97% of traffic internally in IPv6. The problem we see right now in community is not that there's lack of encouragement for IPv6. There's lack of discouragement for IPv4.
Sorry, hang on a second.
Oh, sure. Even closer?
Yeah.
Yes, so the problem is people still think IPv4 is a long-term thing, and we often see that we often hit issues even in major vendor implementations in IPv6, right? Like the last one was NetFlow issue, just like last few weeks. The problem is that people spend lots of efforts on IPv4 in IETF and in vendor community, and there isn't enough work being done on IPv6. So we think that it's not enough to encourage IPv6. It would be very helpful if IETF or any other body would discourage IPv4 work. Right now, it just seems like there's lots of effort spent pure on IPv4, and this hinders the progress. So thank you very much for this work. If you need support, like you got this from us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brian Haberman, and I will state right off the bat that if anything comes across as snarky, it's because I won't be an AD in the next 25 hours. I know I've had this conversation with a good set of people over the last couple of years, and I do have sympathy for what you're trying to do. The comment in the Jabber room about an IESG statement would be an interesting one. But the other point that I think people could actually make influence is when you actually see new charter work come in, right? Those things go out for community review, and we can push on the people proposing the charter as much as we think we can. But if we don't get backup from the community saying, no, don't do that, there's not a whole lot for us to do. So it is a community-driven endeavor here, so there are ways to make this happen. If you want a data point for when I think you might be able to do it, I will point to the status change document that's in IETF last call right now for IP version 5, 8, and 9, which we're really only reasonably put out because we haven't seen those things anywhere in 20 plus years.
Marc Blanchet as an individual. Into your, the problems of references in all our documents. So I'm refraining to give my opinion on your work, but, well.
Can I call you a coward to your face for refraining? Only because I respect you can I actually see that.
So I like this, but the point is, are we going to manage, for example, URL specifications where you can enter an IPv4 address, right? And then those URL specs are probably like normative references to, I don't know, 2,000 documents or so. So I'm not suggesting a solution, but thinking more about refs is getting big and huge. But
Obviously, I haven't read the specification. I would have thought that the ability to do an address literal, A, would be deprecated, and B, is not normative to the URL syntax. That it's an option, but by doing it by saying we're not going to provide any more support for that, I don't think we've deprecated the entire specification. Or sorry, I don't think we've rendered the entire specification historic.
I think there's a few, we should get rid of IPv4 literals because that's the big problem we have with, NAT64. But I think there's more we go into, looking into references of references, we'll find those, I think big issues. The other that comes to mind is all the SIP stack, stuff, which is all, all over the place with, V4. It's just, how could we manage that in terms of documents?
I'm
seems
sorry,
to be
you faded off,
very
you
big.
tailed off at the end there. I missed it. So the SIP stack, what?
Well, SIP is by default super deep into V4 and V6, signaling, and so there's a lot of dependencies there. I don't know how we can manage to deprecate or whatever status within the set of the documents. So
Sounds like those are things that we need to make sure make it into the SUNSET4 gap analysis.
Hi, it's Mark Townsley here. I said this in the Jabber room, but I want to say it at the microphone. I think we'd be better served overall, and I believe I'm agreeing with some of what Eric said a moment ago, to focus on making V6 only as viable as possible rather than just trying to shoot IPv4 as a way to get to that end. There's still a lot of positive stuff to do there. I'd like to also note that I'm surprised we're not talking about technical fragmentation of the internet here and I think there's a subtle issue. Let me paint a picture. You're a brave operator that reads this document and says, oh, V4 is historic. I can't get any addresses anyway. I'm going to launch V6 only service in my country. Most of the content in that country isn't on V6, but I launched the service anyway because most of my users only care about Google and Facebook and those few American operators that are on V6. And then my government steps in and says, what are you doing here? You're competing with the local incumbents, et cetera, and blocks my ability to launch my service because I'm unfairly disconnecting my users from a big portion of the internet. These kinds of things could happen, right? And it's a really, really tough issue. It's one that the IETF maybe wants to sidestep. But if you get into this, I think you can't avoid it.
It's an interesting example because I also have heard of a case where a regulator said, wait, you can't get any more IPv4 addresses, and so if you're a new operator who's beginning in the market, you have to deploy NAT, and your competitors don't, and that puts you at a technical competitive disadvantage. That's restraining competition, and therefore we need to require IPv6. So what an interesting comparison we've got there. I totally agree with you. I would love to see IPv6 be, whatever it was that you said, more good. Would love to see recommendations for ways that it can be so. Would also love to stop retrofitting features into V4, and that's, I guess, actually in response to Barbara's question half an hour ago, that one of the things that I think we've done a disservice to ourselves in advancing V6 is V6 can't get any better than V4 because every time we come up with a feature in V6, we backport it to V4, which to Philip's point is sort of the point. I don't care about it if it's only in V6. Did I characterize everybody's position correctly? I think I went around the room there.
Jumped around a lot. I'm trying to simply state that if we can make V6 only service viable technically, as well as convince whomever has control points and power over the situation that V6 service is internet service, then we will be setting ourselves up for the potential to actually be able to turn off V4 without repercussions that we may not expect if we just walk in and say, oh, turn it all off because we said so.
So I think I
Pave
agree.
the way
I think
for
I
V6
agree with
only
you.
rather than shoot at V4.
I think I agree with you, but I also think that we agree that that doesn't sound like IETF work, convincing regulators that V6
Maybe
only.
we're doing it right now because you were talking about, oh, but wait, I've already heard about this other case, where V4 exhaustion affected the operator in this way. Having that as a referenceable material for whatever body, maybe it's the World Economic Forum or somebody, to point to and go, oh, this is what the IETF believes about this. Could be a positive thing to come out of this for V6 rather than trying to make it a negative thing for V4. You know what I mean? Anyhow.
Fred had a question from the floor, and Mark's about to respond.
That's why it's complicated. Maybe I just screwed myself.
So Fred's question was, do I not minute that about restraint of trade?
Will Ivancic with NASA. I admire your attempt to accelerate evolution, but most likely you just have to let evolution take its course. Consider your telephone number and what it meant at one time and what it means today.
Barbara Stark. So after having heard all of this discussion, I have to say, I think I agree with what you're trying to do. But I do think that based on what I've heard, I think it does need to be clear that the goal really is internal to IETF in sending a signal about what type of work, it's going to be a high bar if you want to do new IPv4 stuff. And we're not trying to shoot IPv4. To Mark's phrase, we're not trying to, send signals to the outside that are going to cause eye rolling and things like that. The other point I wanted to bring up, as someone who's always been very pragmatic about standards, which I know a lot of people really hate, is if you really want something done where there's a will, there's a way. Even if IETF says, no, we're not going to do new standards track stuff, okay, how about if we do an informational? Okay, how about if I go to some other place? I don't think it's going to stop anybody from getting done what really, really needs to be done and what's really important. And I think to the internal IETF, I think this would send the right message.
Thank you.
Hi, David Skenazy here. So first off, I really agree with Barbara, but on the specific point of IPv4 to IPv6 transition technologies, I think the only way we will successfully deploy V6 only is through transition. The first step will probably be mobile carriers going V6 only with translators. We've already seen it on some of them. Those transition technologies aren't perfect. We're working on some of them. We're finding issues. If you say we can't fix them until they've become useless, that's not helpful. They're still very useful until all the content switches.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Having written the documents and then having the tool close, I was going to take that language based on comments. I'm wondering if it would be fair to say we're not interested in new transition technologies, or if it's too soon to say even that. I mean, we can modifying existing transition technologies to optimize them based on a field experience is a little different than introducing new ones, but it may be.
Well, just saying we don't want new ones just means that if someone has a good idea, they can't use it.
My argument would be if it takes us a year or two to standardize it and then a year or two to get it deployed, then it may be too late anyway, but I could be wrong about that. And so, all right, well, I'll take the link, make it in, right, okay. So, well, if there's another revision, which I'm sort of thinking there will be, but maybe not next week. Yes, got it.
Michael Abramson. So I think, for instance, when Apple was started to talk about IPv4 IPv6 only at mobile operators, that was a big symbolic value in that statement. That made a lot of people wake up. I would like to be able to make this kind of symbolic statement, put the stake in the ground, without the ridicule that we're talking about as well. But it's like, there are some operators that are now V6 only, is like, just want to get rid of IPv4. And there is, on the other side of the spectrum, there are people who are like, they barely even heard about IPv6. It's like, they think, some people still think it's not going to happen. So the question is, how can we make this symbolic statement whilst not really just putting a straitjacket on ourselves to say, yeah, we're never going to do anything like this again? Because I do want this to end up, like when the RFC was published about IPv6 support is mandatory, that flew by that RFC and nobody noticed. No newspaper articles that I'm aware of, anything. I would actually like this to end up in newspapers and so on, but I would like to see a positive spin on it instead of ridicule or something like that. But I still think that there is great value in a symbolic statement here to make the rest of the world aware that this is where we're going. And 10% of the global traffic is IPv6 and end up in the headlines. I think that would be a great thing.
Thank you.
Tom Herbert, Facebook. So I'd like to thank you for this work. I think it's actually amazing after watching IPv6 progress all these years. Even having this conversation is pretty stunning. But I would tend to agree. I think we do need some symbolic statement. I think by the definition of historic, that seems like it's a little bit of a binary switch and almost like there's an intermediate step here. I think when somebody deprecates a product, they don't immediately say, we're not going to fix bugs in anymore. So usually there's phase one, which is no new development, but we're certainly fix bugs, and kind of continue along that path. Also, it probably would be nice to have some well-defined metrics for what success is. So for instance, 50% deployment on the internet or something like that might be, at least on the deployment side, kind of indicative of when we can at least declare it historic.
So thank you, and I would like to, who was it that suggested writing a draft that I described, or something which we called V4 will be historic? Can we start a conversation on the mailing list that says will be historic when, and start discussing those metrics? When I say we, would somebody, no, would you please, since you're standing at the mic, send some text to the mailing list so that we have something to respond to?
Well, I mean, I think that would be great, but that's just the mailing list, right? And what I'm really looking for is the message to, say, our vendors. So we still have hardware vendors who think in terms of IPv4, even though at Facebook, we tell them it's all IPv6, it's all IPv6. And we still see this. And one of the comments earlier was, we can't control what's happening on user devices. There are actually some ways we can do this. I mean, we still control the implementation of stacks. And if we have something from IETF that says we're on a path to deprecation, we can actually start to lead some of these products and like the host stacks towards giving more preference or more focus on IPv6. So to me, it's always going to be some sort of transitional thing. There's never, as you say, the flag day, but the path is the most important part. And I think that one of the important parts of this path is some statement saying, yes, IPv6 is now it. IPv4 is going away in some indefinite amount of time, but it's definitely on the less preferred list somehow.
Thank you.
David Simmers-Harris from Brockton. Just in response to your suggestion that we only look at existing transition technologies, not add new ones. I remember from Yokohama that in that V6 ops, there was some vehement statements or consensus that the current transition technologies are at a state that they cannot be, none of them can be recommended, but that's all we have. And so everyone's hoping, crossing your fingers, waiting for a new one that will actually not have issues like the ones that currently do. So that's just something to consider before, making it difficult to have a new one.
Yeah, it may turn out that somebody does have a brilliant idea that can be deployed in time to be useful. Fair enough, okay.
Right. And then one thing, just want to agree with Barbara, hearing your presentation, I think the rationale was very clear for declaring V6 as historic, but the purpose wasn't. So I just want to back up that request to make the purpose very clear. This is what we're trying to do by declaring it V4 historic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Würdiger Volk. How about the IETF declaring end of engineering for this product?
Is that different than this? I don't know what that means. I mean, so.
I think it's more like deprecate.
My company actually has a formal definition of end of engineering and end of life. End of life is what the IETF would call historic, as in you can't buy it from us anymore. End of engineering means, well, you can buy it, but we're not going to do much more than maybe fix the odd bug.
Thank you. Okay.
I think in terms of media management, if you made an announcement now that IPv4 would go to end of life, I think end of life is probably better because it's an understood term. If you declared end of life in 5 years, that would have a media effect that would be useful in getting IPv6 deployment. I don't think that you're going to get a useful result out of declaring historic. It might, and 5 years would be the absolute minimum, I think, that you could get away with. You might even want to have a longer term, 10 years, but if you did 5 years and then and reviewed at 5 years and extended it for 2 or whatever, that might be another way of herding. But you're looking at media management and the signals you send to the rest of the world. And so talking their vocabulary, so end of life of what they understand.
Thanks, interesting.
Hey, Igor Gashinsky, Yahoo. First of all, Lee, thank you for a great job that you did there. I can't believe I'm about to argue this point since I was one of the original people behind the World IPv6 Day and then the World IPv6 launch. But let's be real here.
Sorry,
yeah,
closer to the mic.
There's no way that we're actually going to make V4 historic right now. And hell, probably not in the next 5 years. If tomorrow somebody comes up with a good way of optimizing ARP, we are going to do it. We are going to continue working on making IPv4 better because for better or worse, it still makes up 90% of our traffic. So if there's a way to optimize it, we will. And it's not honest. It's hypocritical to say that we're going to make it historic. We could say we would like to end of life it in a decade, but honestly, we're not, probably a decade from now, we're still going to be optimizing just like we optimize anything else that is actually operational on the internet. So as much as I hate to say this because I want V4 to go away and V6 to take over, the realist in me says, if I find a way to make V4 work better, 4 years from now, and if it still makes up a good chunk of my traffic, I'm going to push for changes, and my suitcase full of cash of my employer will make that happen.
So, thank you. You did say if V4 is still a good chunk of your traffic, and this sort of goes back to a question I want to ask Philip too. Rather than put something on the calendar, because situations change and it's the internet, time is weird, what's a significant portion? At what point do you stop caring, I guess, about V4?
When it falls below 1%.
When what?
When it falls below 1%.
1%. Okay.
Maybe 10%, you could argue, but the reality is V6.
Single digits at least.
Well,
okay.
V6 is barely above 10% right now of
Yeah.
my traffic.
Yeah.
So I cared about it before. I cared about it when it was 1%. So until it falls below 1%, hell, I cared about when V6 was going to be, when we were going to break 0.02% of the users because of various DNS issues, we cared about that too. It's going to depend on your employer whether you care about it. The reality is, we didn't care about Torito when it fell below what, 0.0001%? Sure, get it below 3 nines, nobody gives a damn. But until that happens.
So we are about 10 minutes before the formal end of the session, and I want a few minutes to kind of summarize what we're doing here. So feel free to make another quick brief comment if there's something relevant, but we should probably close this down.
What I wanted to, I hadn't fully formulated it because I thought I had two people in front of me.
I'm sorry, Mark, who are you?
Mark Townsley. But what I wanted to do is ask David what convinced him to convince his management to put in this enforcement for V6 only verification into the Apple App Store, and if the IETF had anything to do with it. I don't know what the answer to this is going to be. If the IETF helped him, then maybe there's something we can do here. Because those control points are what matter, right? What the Facebook guys did, well, their control point is Paul Saab and friends, right? They took a control point and said, okay, it will be V6 only here. If we saw something like that happen for Windows, maybe that would make it easier for the network to deliver V6 only service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're close to getting to the point where V6 only is viable in controlled situations and need to build upon that.
David Skenazy, Apple. So first off, Mark, thanks for once again putting me on the spot. So unlike what you may believe, it wasn't my idea convincing all of Apple. No, it was, we have a pretty big networking team and there's Stuart in it. But in any case, I think what really led us to try to push for V6 wasn't just it's the cool thing. It was data. It was people like Paul Saab showing like, hey, look, the performance is better. It was realizing, well, actually maintaining dual stack is hard and we keep getting bugs because of how hard it is. It's these kinds of like operational realizations that pushed us to do this. It wasn't dogma or like making it historic wouldn't help us make this kind of decision because like if people have been said like, oh, the IETF is going all ivory tower on us again. No offense. I think that answers your question.
So just to kind of summarize where I think we are, you know, we had a really good discussion, and I appreciate a lot of the folks that brought additional perspective here. I would encourage a lot of the folks who have opinions on this to make sure that they are actually on the SUNSET4 mailing list. We tend to have meetings with SUNSET4 where we have great discussion because we get a lot of tourists, and then when it comes time to actually have discussion, meaningful discussion on the list, nothing happens again. And I think this is one of those things where this absolutely benefits from broad discussion. The whole reason behind this being a working group draft or even considering being a working group draft is that it needs that primary discussion before it becomes a discussion within the IETF at large. So there's clearly lots of feedback that Lee has that he can use to make revisions to his draft and look at other potential avenues for us to make noises in this space about what we think the right thing for the IETF to do and to communicate to other SDOs and things like that. But I also heard from a number of folks that we need to renew our focus on making sure that IPv6 only actually has feature parity or functional parity with IPv4, and that it actually works in terms of our systems and things like that. I think the limitation we have is, you know, IETF, the protocols may have functional parity, but the implementations may not. And so it's a question of what the right forum for discussion of identifying those kinds of problems are. Is it V6 Ops? Is it SUNSET4? I think there are probably still things that we can include in the SUNSET4 gap analysis. I heard things like SIP today where there's probably some gaps there that aren't really addressed in the documents. But we need contributors for those. You know, a lot of the work that is in SUNSET4's charter has kind of died on the vine due to lack of interest. We've had a few people who were willing to really contribute, and as they've moved on to other things, we haven't really been able to finish the work that we're chartered to do. And so if the large majority of the room believes that the way to focus on this in terms of making V4 eventually go away is to make sure that V6 actually is a first-class citizen and works properly by itself, then we've got to make sure that we have those things done. So I'd like to implore you to consider participating more actively in what's going on in Sunset 4.
David Skenazy again. Just a quick comment regarding feature parity. I'd just like to ask for a quick show of hands. Who here has been this week on the IETF NAT64 Wi-Fi or the IETF v6 Wi-Fi? That's how you will know if you have feature parity or not. Because I've been doing that and 99% of my software works. So I would like to encourage everyone to try it. And if you realize that any of your corporate tools doesn't work, go after the people maintaining it.
Okay. Any other comments for the good of the order? Yeah. So,
Yeah. So my conclusion is this document is ready to send to the ISG, right?
No, this is a really good point, David, is that, and back to the point of don't invite ridicule, it's even the IETF meetings don't do V6 only for everybody, and they haven't deprecated V4, so how in the world can they be giving this advice to the rest of the world? Ouch, right? So let's make V6 only work.
It was on my list of possible things to do to ask the IOC to do V6 only.
Okay. I think we are finished. Thank you.
Thanks.
You didn't react for